Time for us to go ahead and get started. We finished up Joshua, and so naturally we're moving on to Judges. Judges is very, very interesting. Should be lots of good things for us to discuss in here. Like I usually do, want to have kind of an introductory lesson to the book, give you some background, general outline and structure of the book, some things like themes to look at going forward. So we're not going to really be diving into the text today, but then we will get there in future weeks. I won't be here next week. Scott's going to be teaching class. I think he intends to start Judges 1, so you can still be ready for that. But then we'll do our introduction today. So the period of the Judges covers from Joshua's death that we saw at the end of Joshua all the way to Saul's coronation. This whole period of time when they don't have kings yet, when they've settled the land, the book of Judges actually cuts off a little bit sooner than Saul's coronation. There are a couple of judges that aren't included in the book of Judges, which I find kind of interesting, but mainly because this is a curated story, a narrative of some of the events that happened in this time. And so there'll be a little bit that gets covered in 1 Samuel where you still have some judges who might not exactly be called judges, but that's really what they are. And we'll see the narrative and the history of the people continue into 1 Samuel as we go on. This book is strongly linked not only with Joshua in the past and 1 Samuel in the future, but also linked to Deuteronomy. Because if you don't understand the law that they were given, then you can't really appreciate the kinds of trouble that Israel gets in. There's a lot of things that they do that are not really explained as to why it's a problem. It's expected that you know that it's a problem because you know Deuteronomy, you know the law that they're under. So we're going to see a degradation of their society as we go on, but remember some of the things that we talked about in the Deuteronomy class, and you'll be able to understand that pretty easily. Israel at this point is transitioning to a different sort of organization. What we saw through the wandering in the wilderness, basically the whole time from where they left Egypt, going in the wilderness, the wandering for the 40 years, and then even into the invasion and conquest of Canaan, we see Israel as a band of people. It's a big old crowd of people that are led by a singular leader, whether that's Moses or Joshua. They had their tribal divisions still. The band could be divided up into different groups. They had other leaders and elders of the people, but they are a mobile band of people that whole time in Exodus, in the covenant books where that's explained to them, and in the book of Joshua. We see them all sticking together. That changes as we get here. Remember, we spent a good portion of the last bit of Joshua talking about how they were now spreading out, going to their tribal allotments. So you have one portion of land that is for the tribe of Judah, another portion that is for another tribe, and now they are spreading out. They are not a band of people roaming from place to place. They're established in a location, and the tribal distinctions mean more now, because there's not that singular leader who's over the whole band. At the same time, they're not yet really a nation. We say a lot of times the nation of Israel in all of these early time periods. And it's not that that's wrong, but it's not really complete at this point. It's hard to describe them as a complete nation. In fact, almost the only way that they are a nation is because God has made a covenant with all of them. and because they have some kinds of connections with each other. But way more important than any nation relationship is the tribal relationship. We're not going to see a proper national government or a state that has been established. This is actually a pretty early part of history still, where there weren't a lot of defined nations like that. Egypt was. When Israel left Egypt, that was a kingdom, an empire that had a singular leader. But remember that when they were invading Canaan, that was a lot of small semi-nomadic groups or cities, and you'd have a powerful leader who kind of exerted control over one city or a small group of cities. You didn't really have the established nation of whatever quite that early on in history, at least not commonly. There were some, but not as common. And Israel follows that same pattern. So there's the influential princes, leaders, kings, even called kings, but still not exactly a kingdom. So for Israel, the arrangement is mostly on the tribal level. So the most important community relationships that they have, starting at the family level, and the family level was more than just mom, dad, and the kids. It's the extended family. It's everyone who's related to each other, the cousins, the uncles, the aunts, the grandparents, all who lived in close proximity to each other. Those family bonds were extremely important to them. They didn't have this concept of moving far away from home or being really removed from your parents or your grandparents. Those extended family units stayed, not always in the same house, though sometimes they did, but at least in the same, in close proximity to each other. Well, then they had the concept of a clan, and a clan was a collection of families that could trace back to some important ancestor. So they are related to each other as well, but not quite as closely as the extended family might be. But because they know, hey, my family's related to this important person in our history, and your family's related to this important person in history, we are related, we are connected in some way, we are part of the same clan. And the importance of that clan was strong enough that it's hard for us to even completely understand. It was strong enough that if there was a dispute, your clansman was involved in some dispute, you were obligated to take his side in that. Regardless of the truth of the matter, regardless of who was right or wrong, you need to support the fellow member of your clan. The same kind of thing is going to be true for families as well. And then beyond clan, you have the tribe. And those are the 12 tribes of Israel. It was important that you were part of the tribe of Judah or Asher or Ephraim or whatever tribe that you were a member of. That was an important unit that you belonged to. And lineages were carefully recorded so that you knew what tribe and what clan you belonged to. They were very proud of that, and that was the social structure of their lives. When they made treaties and covenants, it was mostly on the tribal level. You wouldn't have anybody making a covenant or a treaty with Israel. It was making that treaty with Zebulun or with Manasseh, with a tribe, and the tribes would make treaties and covenants with each other. So these 12 tribes of Israel are really more of a confederation of tribes, a confederacy, a loosely bound together organization. And so the affairs of one tribe don't have a lot to do with the others. It's more removed than our states are in America today. You go from California to Arizona to New Mexico to Texas. There are differences, but we're Americans. You can move from one state to another. The things that affect the whole nation are going to affect all the states. They were more separate than that. The things that affected one tribe did not necessarily affect the others. It would be ridiculous today for a nation to declare war only on the state of California, but we're not going to declare war on the rest of America. You can't really do that. But you could declare war against Judah, but not Benjamin or not Ephraim. And that you could legitimately have an entire war where you're only against that one tribe. I just want you to kind of understand how separate they were, how distinct they were. So some of the tribes got along better with each other than they might with some others. Some of that was proximity, some of that, like Ephraim and Manasseh, having a particularly close bond, both being part of the greater house of Joseph. But the tribes didn't always get along with each other, and sometimes there was conflict. Sometimes they could be upset with each other, or they would make treaties with each other. It's kind of everything that was happening socially at that time. You with me so far? Any questions or comments on any of that? We also need to bring up the term harem again. This is something that we talked about in Joshua, somewhat a technical term that doesn't mean a lot to us outside of this biblical context. But harem was one of those major concepts in the book of Joshua, and the word doesn't come up as much in Judges, but the concept definitely does. So harem as a noun means devoted thing, but usually not in a good way. Usually it is a thing that is devoted to destruction. And that's why the verb form of it means totally destroy. And that's what God wanted the people to do with the Canaanites who lived there, the inhabitants of this land. They were devoted to destruction. God had decided that their time was up. Israel was to completely and totally destroy the inhabitants of the land. Now, we already learned in Joshua that they were inconsistent with that. There were some of the peoples that they totally destroyed, that harem was applied consistently, and then others that it was not applied consistently, whether that's the Gibeonites who fooled the Israelites into making a covenant with them, or where they just kind of ran out of steam and stopped attacking some of these people, or whether they just didn't go far enough north and get to some of the land that they were promised and decided to leave well enough alone. The incompleteness that we saw in the book of Joshua is going to create problems here in the book of Judges, and that shouldn't be a surprise to us. We're going to see the ramifications of that failure on their part in the moral stature of the people and the conflicts that they have with the people around them. There should have been more peace. There should have been less evil influence. But because they didn't complete that harem, they're going to have a bunch of problems. Interestingly, the Israelites do a better job when there is a conflict at devoting another tribe to destruction. We see them become quite angry with the tribe of Benjamin, and they are more consistent and dedicated to destroy Benjamin than they are with some of the people that they were actually supposed to destroy. So this shows kind of the wishy-washy evil nature of the people. Yes, Kay.
I thought it was interesting that God became so unhappy with the people that he said he was not going to drive the people out, the inhabitants of the land out himself.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to help them with that anymore.
Right. There's some of like what we saw in Joshua of God has delivered on his promise to give them the land, and it's there within their grasp. But then because they don't want to go and finish the job, God says, I'm not going to spoon feed you. I'm not going to finish it for you with no action on your part. If you're not going to do this, then you don't get all of the land that was promised to you. You don't get the peace that you should have had with driving all of these people out. So, who were the judges? It's the title of the book. It's a commonly used word in our everyday language, but it's kind of a weird word and a weird title to apply to these people. In some ways, I wish that it wasn't translated as judges, because it's not a great summary of what these people really were. If you hear about a judge in our society, you imagine somebody who's in charge of the proceedings at a courtroom, and they're dealing with trials and making judgments. And the judges here aren't exactly that. They did issue judgments, they did decide some internal things like that, and they were looked up to as leaders, but they're a lot more than that. These people were warriors, leaders, heroes, spiritual guides, deliverers. They're a lot more than just somebody making a legal decision. They're rescuing people from oppressors. They're making rulings, yes, in conflicts and in internal struggles, but they're also doing a lot to save the people from the oppressors who are troubling them, who are oppressing them. So when you hear the word judges, and we're going to use the word judges throughout all of this, you have to understand that it's more than just the guy in a black robe with a gavel. There's a lot more to it than that. Additionally, these judges are not always particularly good people. And that is one of the crises we have in the book of Judges. Remember how we talked about in Joshua that there were some tricky things that we had to untangle and understand from what they were told to do. Well, one of the problems we have in the book of Judges is that the judges can sometimes be pretty evil. They can have some serious character flaws. And that can be one of our mistakes when we isolate the story of some judge and we say, hey, look at Gideon. Gideon was a good person and is a role model for us in every way. He's not. Gideon, his story ends badly. Samson, his story ends pretty badly, and it's kind of bad throughout a lot of it. These people are not always righteous, and we have to understand why. Okay?
I thought it was pretty interesting that Samson did judge the people for 20 years.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just off being bad. He was acting as the judge for a long period of time, 20 years.
Yes. So, and that's a good point too. There's some complexity to these characters. It's not that they're either totally good or totally evil. They all serve the purpose of delivering the people of Israel, of rescuing them from oppressors, and of being some kind of spiritual guide. But they do that to varying degrees of success, and whether that lasts or not depends a lot on the judge as well. What was I going to say about that? Yeah, not only, and it's even less random than this. We see a pretty clear pattern going down. At the beginning of the book of Judges, the judges are pretty good. They are good role models, good spiritual guides. They're rescuing the people and things are going well. But the deeper you get into the book, the more morally gray or dubious or even outright wicked the judges become, either in whole or in part. And so you see the progressive nature of the sin of these judges that's supposed to reflect the progressive sin of the tribes of Israel, because their state is degrading as time goes on as well. This is a curated narrative of history meant to illustrate how things were declining all throughout. And even just the character of the judges is a way to understand that as well. Okay?
Another thing I thought was interesting was the judges were from all over. They weren't from just one area. They were from all different tribes.
Right. And to elaborate on that a little bit more, not only were the judges from more than one area, they're not necessarily national deliverers. Remember, we talked about how things are happening more on a tribal level. These judges are solving problems locally and regionally rather than rescuing all of Israel. And part of how we know that is if you add up all the years of the judges and how long they judged, you've got too many years. Like there's a little bit of wiggle room because we don't know quite how long this period is, but it's just too many years. So really what that means is there's some overlap here. That it's not that first you have Othniel and then you have Ehud and then down the line as sequential judges of Israel, but rather you have judges rising up in different places at different times. And sometimes they're overlapping because the way that they're delivering the people is they're solving a problem in one corner of the nation, in one area that's dealing with one or two tribes or a region of tribes. So they're able to overlap in that way. We read this as a sequential history because that's the way it's written, but just like everything else in real life, the problems that a nation faces don't come sequentially where we have to completely solve one and then it's gone, and then now we come up with problem number 2, and then it's solved, and then we come up with problem 3. There's more overlap than that. Yeah, okay.
How many years did you come up with this period covering?
This probably covers about 300 years, is probably what is more realistic. If you add up all of the time that the judges were judging, you've got over 400. And so, maybe that is still correct, but there's also nothing wrong with there being some overlap because we don't have to have problems that cover the entire nation because they're not really an entire nation yet. They're operating more on a tribal level. So one judge is able to liberate a tribe or a small group of tribes from the oppression of a people. And as he's wrapping up, another judge can be rising up in a different place, dealing with a different problem for a different tribe. And there's no problem there. That's just sort of the way that history can overlap. Kathy.
I thought it was interesting about Deborah, how she was a judge in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that she was the only one who really had, like you were describing, a desk and people came in to see her and went out. Maybe because it was in the mountains, I don't know. Maybe because she was a woman and she had a family. I don't know. I'm just guessing, but I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and part of what complicates this too is not everything about every judge is even told to us. And that's, we have certain things highlighted about these judges that are important for us to know, but actually half of these judges we know almost nothing about. We get just a brief summary statement. And they did all sorts of things too. It's not that they're not important and that they didn't deliver the people. It's that they're just not as crucial to the narrative that this book is showing. And so others may have had arrangements like that, but the story of Deborah focuses more on that because that's germane to the story of Deborah. That's what can complicate it a little for us. Steve, do you have something?
Yeah, just a question. How did the judges get their authority?
So that is a good question. I'll answer that in just a second because first let me hit this and then that's my next slide. What I'm alluding to there is there's a concept of major and minor judges throughout. We've got 6 of the judges that have full stories given for them. And you can think of those as major judges. And then we have other judges that just have a summary statement. There's just a brief note about them. And that's kind of a minor judge. And a little bit like the major and minor prophets that we have in the Bible, it's not that they're less important or they didn't do as much, it's that we have less written about them. The book of Isaiah is long. We have a lot of information about what he said and did. Jeremiah is long. We have lots that he said and did. That doesn't mean that they were more important than Habakkuk or Micah or some of these others that only have some brief things said about them. It's just what has been revealed to us, what has been recorded in the narrative of the Bible. Same kind of thing here with the judges. Some of them we know a lot about, and some of them not so much. That's just because we need to follow certain stories to explain the history of this time. Okay, so to Steve's point, how do these judges get their authority and kind of how did they rise up? When we look at the basic cycle, we're going to answer that question in this. The basic cycle that we see in the book of Judges is that Israel does evil, God gives them over to oppressors, Philistines or somebody else, that they're able to come in and take part of a land, able to enslave them, exact tribute from them, attack them, kill people, whatever the case may be. Israel serves the oppressor for a period of time. They cry out to God for deliverance, and God raises up a deliverer. And this is kind of a step that Steve is asking about, that God raises up this person, fills them with the Spirit, is giving them a word from the Lord, like a prophet, that they have an inspired message to say. So these judges actually overlap with the concept of a prophet quite a bit. They're just even more than a prophet because they're actually a deliverer and warrior in a way that Jeremiah wasn't a warrior, wasn't actually delivering them from the hands of their oppressors. So they're empowered by the Spirit of God. They're given an inspired message from God to preach to the people, and more than that, to then deliver the people through even the force of military might. So the oppressor is defeated and pushed back, pushed away from them, and the land has rest for some years until we get back to the top of this and we start all over. Okay?
Well, I thought it was interesting. Some of the judges took this willingly and came forward willingly, and others didn't.
Right.
Gideon didn't want to be a deliverer. He thought he was too insignificant. So it's interesting the difference you see there in personalities.
It is that's part of the kind of downward slope we have in the book as these judges get more morally dubious. We see some more hesitation, particularly from Gideon, but more hesitation to actually do what God is calling them to do. Again, reflecting real life, that people do not always do what they're supposed to do, can be hesitant, can be flawed and evil, and we see that happening more as the book progresses. Kathy.
In chapter 9, it talks about Abimelech and how he made himself the king for the people. Rose him up, so he was not chosen by God.
Right. And Abimelech that's part of the story of Gideon in a lot of ways. Abimelech comes about because of Gideon's evil and failure. And so he is part of a pair in a way that Deborah and Barak are part of a pair. And so whether you call him a judge or not is very interesting and will give us lots to discuss when we get to that chapter for sure. But you have identified something interesting for sure. Oh, let me see. So, the basic cycle. But I don't want you to look at this basic cycle and think the book just repeats these things in order over and over. No, actually, what is interesting about this is it's not a flat cycle where these events repeat in exactly the same way every time. Instead, we're spiraling down. And part of that's in the character of the people, the character of the judges, but part of that is in the fact that this basic cycle is breaking down. So the farther you get into the book, the more the oppression part stands out. The harder the oppression is, the longer they're having to deal with those people, the worse the deliverers are, the harder it is to push back the oppressors, and the shorter the peace is, until by the end of it, you don't even really have the rest for some years. It's like there's deliverance, and then we just immediately are back to oppressors. That's part of the spiral of this. Imagine if you have this big circle. You ever done one of those, like I'm at museums and places sometimes, where you can put the coin into the little spiral thing that's able to roll around and around this slope until it gets all the way down to the bottom? Kids love those things because you can watch it go, and what happens as it's getting farther and farther down that? Yeah, speeds up faster and faster and faster, and the circles are getting tighter and tighter and tighter until by the time it's down at the bottom, it's whipping around really fast and shoots into the bottom of that thing. That's Judges. Like that's what the whole book of Judges is doing. You start with a cycle, and then it's just going to get faster and faster and worse, and to a greater degree of moral depravity. And it's going to break down in that their rest and their deliverance becomes shakier and lasts a shorter amount of time before we're already back to another oppression. Make sense? Steve?
And this need and want, the birth of this seems to me that there's a need and a want for eventually a righteous king.
Right. Yes. This is pushing them toward a desire to have a more centralized government. That's going to be a whole interesting story that comes up in 1 Samuel as to why they get to that point. But this situation is becoming untenable. It's just getting unbalanced and unstable to the point that even in their depravity, they realize we need something else. And the way they seek that is not completely right, but it still is just part of the story of history here. Kathy?
I was wondering, God gave the authority to the priest that they were to teach all the people everything about God. So when we get to Judges, and I wonder the difference between the priest and the judges. And I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it, but I just have that question, what happened with the priests then, that it doesn't seem like they're prominent in this.
Right. So that's a good question, and it's a question that similarly comes up when you talk about the prophets, because the prophets that come later generally aren't priests. But the priests were not the only people who had the ability or the right to teach the law and to lead the people in some religious way. In fact, every tribe, every family should have spiritually mature people who are giving wise counsel, who are calling upon their family, their clan, their tribe, the nation, to make good choices, to execute wisdom and justice in the land. That should always come from a variety of places beyond the priesthood. The limitations were that the priests were the ones who were supposed to be offering those sacrifices. And so the judges shouldn't be doing that, and we don't see them doing that. But the priests are not the only people who can be religious leaders among the people. And that's why God is able to raise up prophets, judges, these other leaders from other tribes. They're not serving the role of priest. They're serving a different role that has a lot of overlap. And when it's going well, there should be, good synergy there. that the priest and the prophet, or the priest and the deliverer of a judge, are reinforcing each other, are saying the same kinds of things. It's just like today, would we say that the only people in the church who are to be religious leaders are, elders, deacons, preachers? Those are the only people who can. There should be spiritually mature and wise people even beyond those roles. We see the same sort of thing in Israel. Does that answer your question there? Yeah. But we do see that God takes seriously when people infringe on the specific role of the priests. When people are offering sacrifices that shouldn't be, that's not appropriate to God. Or going into the most holy place, things like that. Steve?
When God raised up a judge, how did the people know that they were supposed to listen to him?
Much like with the prophets, of giving a message that is supposed to be along with the law that they already know. Typically by this point, when the judges are raised up, the people are desperate and they're seeking salvation. And so somebody who has the ability to save them, they're going to cling to, and hopefully that's going to be somebody righteous and somebody leading them in the right way. But the judges are not really giving them anything new. The message that they are preaching and teaching is just return to the covenant that God has made with you, and He will save you. He will release you from the bondage of these oppressors, and I will lead you into battle against them so that we can push them away from us. So that's a message that anybody who understands the law should be able to identify as correct and true. If there were something new, that would be harder for sure, but there isn't really here. Okay.
I think a good example of that for us in today's times is during the Second World War, Eisenhower was in charge of everything in Europe. And then after the war, he was elected president, so he went on helping make laws and regulations. I think that's kind of maybe the way some of these judges were.
Right, yeah, absolutely. We've got some women in the book of Judges that we'll get to their stories as we progress throughout the book, but I kind of want you to see that they follow the same decline that everybody else does in the book of Judges. As we see the people as a whole, as we see the judges themselves, we also see these different featured women throughout the book who are declining either as a cause or a symptom. It comes both ways. And what I mean by that is either in their own character or in their own victimhood. The early women in the book are practical, smart, holy, righteous. There are people like Asa and Deborah and others who clearly know what they're doing and clearly are acting in a righteous and smart way. Then you kind of get more morally ambiguous, but maybe still heroic. You have, Jael has a weird combination of things that she's doing, but she's heroic in how she kills Sisera. So that works. There's the certain woman, Thebes, who kills Abimelech, throws a stone down from the wall and kills him. There's Jephthah's daughter, who is kind of a victim of her father's rash and manipulative vow. She's kind of a victim of some morally ambiguous, gray kind of events. Then as you get even deeper into the book, you just get to outright evil women, or women who are very victimized in extreme ways. So Delilah, very evil and manipulative, not a lot that redeems her. The Levite's concubine is horribly mistreated and abused and killed. She is a victim in an extreme way. The young women of Jabesh Gilead are captured to be wives for the Benjamites. They're pretty passive and victims in that story. So the point here is that the progression we see with the women of the book follows the same general pattern as everything else. Start out as practical, smart, holy, able to act on their own accord, and then progressing down to, if they're acting of their own accord, it's in evil ways, and if they're not, then they're victims of mistreatment and abuse by others. And that's just reflective of everything that's going on in the book. So you can think about that as we run across their stories throughout the book. Little structure and outline. There's a double introduction that is given, 2 different stories meant to illustrate the condition of the people and of the tribes. We first see the harem wars against other peoples, other nations around them, and how that's going. We'll see some of the problems that we saw from the book of Joshua. And we see trouble with foreign idols. This is all in the first kind of 2+ chapters of the book. Then there's a cyclical history. That basic cycle we talked about, that covers most of the book. From early on in chapter 3 through the end of chapter 16, we see these judges and how they're delivering the people in these different scenarios. I have the major ones outlined for you here. Othniel, Ehud, Deborah and Barak are together. Gideon and Abimelech are together. It's kind of together in the story. Then Jephthah, then Samson. But then there's also the minor judges, Shamgar, Tola, and Jair, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon. Those are people that we only have small summary statements, small details about. So they're kind of tacked on to the major judge that's a part of that cycle that they're in. So we will follow their stories and the condition of the people, kind of in this order as we go through the book. Then we get to a double conclusion in chapter 17 and 18, or actually farther than that, 17 through the end of 21. I got that typo there. 17 through the end of 21, where again we have 2 stories that conclude the book. And these parallel what we saw in the double introduction. So before we had trouble with idols in these foreign lands, now we get trouble with idols among the people. Before we had the harem wars against other people, and now we have harem wars among themselves as the tribes are kind of fighting amongst themselves and things. But what I want you to know and to understand is this is not chronological. Actually, the events that we see at the end of the book happen about the same time as the things at the beginning of the book. These are not chronological events. We know that because Moses' grandson makes an appearance at the end of this book. Moses' grandson was not alive, 300 plus years past when the judges were alive. That didn't happen. So these things are arranged thematically to help us understand what's going on during this time. The beginning and the end show us how the consequences of Israel's failure to destroy all the people and to keep themselves separate from the nations around them creates problems, both literally with those nations, oftentimes being their oppressors or being evil influences on them, but then also in how the worship of idols, of these pagan rituals, comes from those lands and from the peoples who are among them until it is now actually in their own lives as well. And so that's bookended for us so that we see that all that cyclical history is informed by the events on either side. Okay?
Do you think Samuel wrote this?
It is possible that he did, and he probably wrote at least parts of it. There are some references in the book that seem to have been added later on, because we have reference to the exile in there. some things that could have been written later, but Samuel probably wrote most or all of the book. Kathy?
I didn't hear what Kay said. Could you just repeat that?
Do I think that Samuel wrote the book of Judges? It's quite possible that he did. It's a lot of times these books have more than one author, or there are bits that are added on later, which is not a problem for the inspiration of the book. But yes, Samuel is probably the one who wrote it. Okay. Last little note is that Eli and Samuel would be considered judges as well. They serve that role of deliverer and spiritual guide in much the same way, but they're not in this book because they're just not part of this narrative. We'll see them as we get into 1 Samuel. Okay, thanks everybody. Next week, on to Judges chapter 1.